museum is yours for the next 5 minutes.
Jeg vil se himlen drøbe af kaos og granat. Vi vil vække de sovnes hjerter, for jeg vil hele dig, så du kan hele mig. Vi vil hælde, hælde livet op, inden alt rives fra hinanden. En revolte af kys som regn, en rose, der vokser i din hudshave, for ingen kan omfavne vægten, kun dreje i tusind år, indtil Sulamet står brud i den klare, rene luft. Jeg vil ligge i den varme regn, for jeg vil hele dig, så du kan hele mig. Vi vil vække de sovnes hjerter, inden alt rives fra hinanden. En revolte af kys som regn, en rose, der vokser i din hudshave, for ingen kan omfavne vægten, kun dreje i tusind år. Og de fortalte hinanden for mange hemmeligheder, og de ville gå vejen uden at se sig tilbage. Og de fortalte hinanden for mange hemmeligheder, og de ville gå vejen uden at se
applause. We're we're the only one at the
Thank you.
museum. Marie, it was really great. I followed. It looked good. All the videos and stuff
Oh,
mixed
good.
in.
I'm
That's
happy
great.
to hear that.
Yeah, Marie, life as a musician during COVID-19 has not been that easy and fun, you can say. And we
No.
all kind of wait to get the shots.
Yeah.
So we can get out and have fun again.
Mm.
But I know you have also been working with ways to reach your audience, even though concert have not been
Yeah.
kind of the regular thing these
Yeah.
days.
Yeah.
So could you just in 2 seconds,
2 seconds.
no, 2 minutes,
Okay.
yeah, that's better,
That's better.
explain,
Yeah.
and then we'll post a link afterwards for.
Yeah. So basically, what I've tried to do is what I've also missed most is like when we can't have this physical closeness at the concerts, how can we be close in other ways
Mm.
through our other senses? So there's this sentence that sound is like touching at a distance. And I think that, and it's not a metaphor, it's like it's physical vibrations that I touch you with in your ear. And so I've tried to see if there's a potential in both, like in concert settings where we can't be close, to make a more sensory concert format. And so I took people up on the big rotating stage at Aarhus Theatre with good distance, and we tried to make this sort of sensory concert format. And then I also made this into a virtual reality 360 version. I'll just take the glasses.
Yeah.
So what we did was made this small concert video that you can watch on Oculus Rift or whatever, together with Cora and Aarhus Theatre, but also because I want to go to nursing homes for elderlies to give them the opportunity when I can to kind of also have a way into the concert hall. And so that's basically what I've tried to do.
That's great, Marie.
Thank
We're
you.
really pleased that you gave us this experience in the museum, and we'll post on Facebook and online a link.
And thank you for letting us play here.
Yeah.
And we tried to also kind of use the museum as an instrument today,
we
a little bit.
Yeah, it was
So
super good.
that's also a way we try to like make the closeness.
You're the
other
first
ways.
one that played on alto and art.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. All right. Now I'll leave you for 15, 20 seconds, hopefully not longer, and then I'll get the discussion started with our three panelists. So see you in a short while. Live from Copenhagen, Sydney, and Aalborg. So now I'll just briefly introduce you, and then we'll get the discussion going. We have you, Louise Hiram. You are the CEO of the Sydney Opera House, and it's not a secret that it's really one of my favorite places in the world. And, it's also one of the busiest cultural institutions in the world, I think. And then we have Kasper Holten. And Kasper, you are the director of the Royal Danish Theatre in Copenhagen. And I must say that I'm also really in favor of some of your buildings. So that's good. And then we have Paul Erik Tøjner, director of Louisiana Museum of Modern Art, just north of Copenhagen. And also a pretty nice spot in the world. So thanks for joining. And to the audience, as usual, you can post questions, and I'll try to pick up on some of them, hopefully in the end of the talk. The opening statement and what we said about this talk was, do we still need iconic architectural landmarks? And how well are they coming of age? well do the major cultural institutions of the world respond to the challenges of the 21st century? And what is actually the role of the major cultural institutions in the time we are in, both now in a crazy time, but also beyond? So, Louise, how are things in Sydney, and what is actually the role of the Sydney Opera House? That's two questions, but we're really looking forward to hearing how things are in Sydney.
Okay, thank you so much. And it's a real pleasure and honor to be with you today, and also with Paul Erik and Kasper, two institutions I respect so much, as well as, of course, the Utzon Centre in Aalborg, which is a marvellous place. Well, we in Australia are in an incredibly fortunate position in that we're open again. And I was just saying before that over the last couple of months since we've been fully reopened, we've, I mean, audiences are at 75%, but we have had more than 100, we've sold more than 100,000 tickets to more than 300 performances. And if I compare January this year to January last year, we only have 28% fewer performances than we had this time last year. So to people who are concerned that, you know, when it's over, you know, the world will be an entirely different place, I can say that our experience is that's not the case. Our experience is that that everything that we're continuing to do, everything that we did, plus everything that we've learned during COVID. For example, we set up an online channel called From Our House to Yours, and we had more than 7 million views and 500,000 hours of content watched over the 6 months that we were closed. And now to our festivals, we're selling about 30% of our tickets are online tickets. So we're getting as many people coming, plus we're getting this additional digital audience. So I'd say we've learned a lot of new skills, and I think it's really important to apply those new skills once we're reopened, you know, because we can reach people in different places, remote people, disadvantaged people, in a completely different way from before. And as Kasper and Paul Erik and I were talking about, you know, that we all have institutions that receive, in both of our case, in Louisiana and our case, you know, about 20% government support, more for the Royal Danish Theatre. But we have been able to survive through government support. And what that means is that we're able to be the backbone of the community. And I think that a community without a form of live culture, you know, some participatory culture, whether it's going to a museum or an art gallery or a live performance, you know, it feeds us as individuals. And if you take that away, then you've taken away essentially a really important part of life. And so the major institutions being able to continue means that people have hope, and that we will continue while the smaller organisations haven't been able to survive. We have been able to. So we are an essential backbone and skeleton of the future, I think.
Skeleton of the future. That's something. And also, I think that Paul Erik and Kasper and I, we've been kind of sometimes we don't smile as much as usually because we are closed down. But we've got our smiles back. So Kasper, or Paul Erik and Kasper, how do you see things? Are the cultural institutions community builders? Are they the backbone of society? Kasper, could you?
Sure. I think I always use as a metaphor when you ask me about, you know, the role of these buildings and institutions in a community. You know, if you go to any European city and you want to find the central square, how do you find the center of the city? Just locate the opera house, the old opera house. And it's very telling that the opera houses were always built in the 19th and 20th century in a very central location, because opera houses were ideally meeting places for ideas, for disciplines, for people coming together. And I do think it's fair to say that some of us have lost a bit of that. The sense of self-sufficiency has sometimes snuck in. And I think actually the current crisis is quite a good provocation, having kept in mind that it's a health crisis and people are suffering terrible losses. But for us, it also provokes us to think about rebuilding these ties with our community, that we can't just have opera singers jetting around the world and audiences jetting around. We have to also be part of the city we are in and rebuild that connection of being a meeting place. And so I think there's even with the dip in international tourism, which of course we all fear, it must also mean that there's a bigger home audience. And so I think this is an opportunity for us to try and redevelop a more sustainable way of these institutions opening up to more people in our community, making more people curious about what's going on. Because inevitably, if people are not traveling, they will be stuck in Copenhagen with nothing to do with their kids. And I think people after this crisis will be super hungry for experiences, for live, for things that they can experience together with other people, for getting out into the world, and not least for the kids who have now been stuck with screens, cold, insensitive screens for months. We saw last year in May, when we could reopen somewhat, that our ticket sales were immensely up. In the middle of a pandemic, people were desperate to buy theater tickets. And I was so encouraged by that. And so although we are closed, I really see potential, but we need to take this as an opportunity to think more about how we connect with the community around us and become the meeting places again. The other second thing I would say is that sometimes when we talk about the institutions, and again, I should mention, of course, that my heart goes out to small institutions like Louise mentioned, who are suffering terribly. We really need to protect the smaller institutions, the freelancers, the new talent, all the people who are not necessarily secure. And I really want support and help for them. But having said that, I think sometimes lazily we assume that institutions are the opposite of freedom and innovation. In my business, I think institutions are precisely a necessity for freedom, a necessity that enables innovation, because in institutions, artists can be employed, can have a lifelong career without having to worry about constantly finding work and making money. We can give them framework in these iconic buildings where they can enable also big scale experiment. It all comes down to how you run the institution. But I think it's time to give up the idea that the institutions represent the past and innovation happens elsewhere. It's a tension between the institutions and the freelancers that really enables true innovation. And we should see the institutions as part of that. And that is why, as Louise said, it is so important to have seen my previous workplace, the Royal Opera House in London, struggling because they don't get enough public support. So through this crisis, it's really been an institution that is now terribly damaged. We in Denmark have come through that relatively well because government subsidy keeps us going. I think it is time to reevaluate this shrinking subsidy that we've seen to institutions over the last decades, and say, for society to invest in a cultural infrastructure that enables audiences to come together has now proven more important than ever before. And I must say, I'm optimistic. I hear a lot of people moaning, but I think it's a little bit maybe also a habit. I see politicians from all parties at the moment actually taking culture and art more seriously than ever before. This crisis has been a wake-up call where also our politicians have become aware that arts is not a luxury. It's actually something that people crave, and that is a necessity to life. We may have to close for a while, but when we reopen, I think there's going to be a large awareness also amongst the politicians. I remain quite the optimist. Again, having said that, it is a health crisis and a lot of people are suffering terrible losses.
So it's going better and better. One more optimist, and it's in the center of the world with the opera house. So Paul, you're based in north of Copenhagen in the landscape, looking over the sea at Louisiana. How things from your perspective?
I mean, Louise said a lot of good things, which are it's edifying news from Australia, I think. And I agree with Kasper and some of his points too. Let me take Louise first. What I find particularly uplifting is the fact that people will come back to the sort of cultural production that we are experts in delivering. Because what I have spotted during the last year is a kind of apocalyptic tone, mainly amongst cultural journalists that are deadly bored because they have nothing to write about. So they get this idea that when we are out on the other side, everything will be new, everything will have changed. I'm very much against that, because I think that the way that we have run institutions the last 50 years, in many ways, is a proven concept and a concept of success. I mean, I can't see why the essence of the aesthetic experience should go away just because some of the conditions are changed. Uh, Moving from there into of Casper's remark, what I find useful about the COVID situation, if anything at all, it is that it has this kind of X-ray effect on culture, that you can actually see now what culture means. But who are you? I mean, I hope the politicians can see it. I see two obstacles here in Denmark, particularly. I mean, there will be a huge bill to pay after this crisis, and I'm not sure that the politicians' engagement in culture will be transformed into cool cash. I would hope so, because I really think that the crisis has been on the necessity of culture amongst people. But let's wait and see. I mean, the support, the public support for culture in the Western world has been declining the last 20 years. So it would be really a kind of revolutionary step if you could turn that situation around and take it seriously, that it is really culture that is the kind of skeleton or backbone or guarantee for freedom, institutional guarantee for freedom. I like all those points. I'm totally behind them. The last thing I would say is that regarding the home market, I mean, the local people, the Louisiana has already and has always been very, very successful in attracting the Danes. I mean, we have more than 400,000 people from Denmark coming. Every year we have a huge club with more than 60,000 members. So there's a great loyalty to our institution. And I'm looking very, very much forward to pay back time after these months, to see all these people again. The identity of our museum is we are an international art museum, and it doesn't necessarily imply that we should count on international visitors. Mainly our task is to show international culture, which means culture from abroad, which means artists that can, be an inspiration for what goes on in Denmark. So all in all, I'm also optimistic. I mean, there are very, very many good things in the Louisiana Museum. We have shows that was not open before the second lockdown, so we are really ready. And I'm also very much aware of the fact that we play this crucial role, even though there are challenges to the concept of what it is to be a representational institution in a diverse culture. And maybe we can come back to these discussions, but basically it's still the same in many ways.
Thanks. Good points. I think that Casper talking about like the major cultural institutions are somewhat hubs for innovation. And Paul, you wrote an essay in the Danish newspaper Weekendavisen this past week, saying that, and noted that cultural is freedom in uncontrollable form, and we need that. And still, even though, Casper, you say that the major cultural institutions are not opposite to innovation and freedom and these kind of things, we've seen from your perspective this discussion of being these major cultural institutions and giving back to, you can say, society and creating innovation. How's that seen from Sydney?
Look, I think it's such an important point, and I also really like the point that Paul Eric made just at the end about, in a diverse society, because I think another role of cultural institutions is to model behavior. So, for example, I mean, you look at the way that the whole of Denmark, for example, focuses on sustainability and efficiency, and you've taught the rest of the world about that. But what about the sustainable development goals, the things like, more equality? Well, this is a time of greater equality, as I was saying, because more people can reach us online as well as in person. It's also a time when I think we are all starting to understand diversity a lot more. And I think it's really important that we showcase that showcase that diversity, which is also something, you know, that we're very pleased to do, and that in a sense that we can, to use Richard Curtis's quote at a conference that we held recently, that cultural institutions with a mandate to serve the community can act as a megaphone for tackling humanity's issues. So if we show how things can be done, if we show what is possible through artistic expression or through being the meeting place, as Casper says, through discussions that we can have, we can actually show and amplify the messages that are so important to our future as humans, allowing people to tell their personal stories at a place that people love to flock to. You know, it's marvelous to hear something in person at Louisiana or at the theatre or at the Hudson Centre or at the Opera House. You know, how can we ensure that we remain those beacons of hope, of challenge, and a sense of being the guiding light?
Paul Erik, and then Casper.
Just a short, I like what you're saying, Louise, just a short point on diversity. I think that one of the good things about, you know, diversity is that if you can present diversity through artistic expression, this is what I like. What I don't like is the obligation to represent diversity. Representing diversity ends up the same way as representing national values. It sort of degrades the institution into a dead monument of different kind of viewpoints, whereas I like the diverse reflection to go into the intrinsic character of everything that happens in the house.
Yeah.
So for me, it's a very, it sounds like a rhetorical thing, very important distinction between presenting and representing. And I like presenting diverse narrative so that people, whoever come, will get different perspectives on their life and their way of behaving in society.
Yeah, I like that.
I think maybe it's important also to say that, I mean, one of the things that's so nice about talking to Louise and Paul Erik is that really Louisiana and the Sydney Opera House have been exemplary in showing over the decades past that you can attract a huge, diverse audience with high quality. And I have to say that I think we have to admit that many other institutions have somewhat failed in doing that and have not been able to attract the diverse audience, so that before we even start talking about diversity, meaning that we represent the entire society around us and the people who live here, you know, many of our institutions are not even diverse in terms of just reaching out to different kind of income groups or people with those different social backgrounds or educational backgrounds. So, you know, many of us are sadly still at a very early stage of diversity in the audience. And I think your houses, the Louisiana and Sydney Opera House, are definitely inspirations of how it is possible to insist on quality and at the same time, and yours too, Lasse, for that matter, up in northern Denmark, but attracting a more diverse audience. But I think what Paul Erik says is a very key point. You know, I had reporters telling me, you know, how will Corona affect opera? And I think what they wanted me to say is like, oh, we're going to see the Corona production of La Boheme next year where Mimi dies of Corona. And I just think like, how boring. You know, how artists are going to react to diversity, to sustainability, to Corona, to all the things that we face as humankind should not be dictated like by managers like me, by people who sit in an office and think strategic. My job as a manager of the institution is to create an environment to attract the artists, to shape the framework that the institution is. And then inside that, trust that the artists will come up with an unexpected, a surprising way to address what happened during COVID, with something that is genuinely artistic and comes from a good idea, rather than being, oh God, we have to now do the Corona production of this and that, which we already see Danish critics and cultural journalists who indeed are bored saying, oh, why does the theatre's repertoire next season not reflect Corona? And, you know, you can easily imagine how ultimately incredibly boring it would be a year from now when we're finally through this to sit and see another production where Mimi has to suffer from Corona or whatever. So I think Paul Erik's point is very important. The way that we think about how we enable those artists to create something that will attract a diverse audience instead of trying to dictate it from the management position. That is a really important distinction.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I also think that we have to take into account, given the we have to take into account, I guess, your initial point, Casper, which is about about where these places are and their attraction. And you can see, the fantastic view that's behind Lesser there, or think of the marvelous landscape of Louisiana, or you think of the architectural marvel that is the Opera House. And it's really important that, and people respond to these buildings and to the landscape and the way that they're positioned sort of from their guts, right? That's not a logical response. And what we're trying to do is that the art that is inside our buildings evokes the same level of passion and enthusiasm and wonder at humanity as the buildings themselves. And in our case, the issue is to get people to come inside, because they look at the outside and they say, oh, but hang on, that's just for rich people and I can't go inside. And that's been another wonderful thing of COVID, is that we have been able to have more people attend remotely, and therefore to see much more of what goes on inside. And we've sold tickets where there was a government initiative to sell $21 tickets, whereas tickets would normally be $150, let's say. And those tickets go on sale immediately to new audiences. So we have a question of price. We have been doing dance classes on the forecourt with 250 people in each class, and we sell out immediately. So this whole idea of, as people are reintroduced to our institutions, how do we reintroduce them in a new way? And I'm not saying we're talking about COVID, because we're not, but we're talking about a sort of a fresh start. And the question that I have challenged our team to say is, if we were starting again, well, actually, we are starting again. So what are we going to do differently? And what are we going to learn from this experience that we've all just been through for the last year? What are we going to learn from that experience that can really enrich the way that we do things in the future? And what we found in the art that we've been presenting is that people love the familiar. So they want to come, and our research showed this, so they want to come to comedy. They want to come to see, graphic art that they already know. They want to come and see productions that they already know, because it gives a sense of comfort that life has returned to normal. I mean, some of it is terribly boring, but it's also to think about the point, as Brecht said, in the dark times, will there be singing? Yes, there'll be singing about the dark times. So we're also trying to encourage the creation of new work, and we set up a fund for local artists to create new work, realizing that there's always a time. You can't reopen and have a whole series of new work, because when would it have been rehearsed? When would it have been written? When would it have been, when would the collaborations have happened? So it's sort of unrealistic to think that it's going to open and it'll all be different. In fact, it'll reopen and it'll all be very similar, because that's what people want. We just want to bring different people in to be part of it.
Casper, you...
Yeah, no, I obviously many good points. I just wanted, because we seem to be agreeing so much, I wanted to be a little bit polemic and maybe say that I heard Paul Eric's worry about the political support and the public subsidy. I just want to say, I really think in the arts, and I know that I speak from a very privileged position, I'm aware of that. I think we should be careful not to always fall into the lazy habit of being victims and of complaining and of saying nobody loves us. It is so easy for us to always complain that nobody discusses culture, nobody wants us. If we look at the facts, we had until 2019 automatic cuts to the subsidies for the arts in Denmark happening every year without question. That has now stopped and been leveled out, so we don't have automatic cuts. And in fact, both the national budgets for 2020 and for 2021 have 2 successive years now been with additional money for the arts. Not everything is perfect. We could always use more. I am sure there are many institutions, including my own, that still feel that we've suffered a lot during the whole shrinking subsidy, and many are suffering terrible losses. I know that, but still, I do see an optimism. And I so worry that we talk ourselves into the corner of like, nobody loves us. It's a pity. We've tried that strategy for 15, 20 years, complaining about the politicians, and it never worked. It turned out that if you complain about being a disaster, nobody wants to support you. I think we need a new dialogue where we talk with more confidence, where we talk about being successful, what we want to do, take control of our own future, and persuade the politicians that that is worth investing in. So seeing the danger signals, and of course maybe being naive, I just think we should be careful not to always be the victims.
I agree. I mean, I'm sorry to say that I agree. So there's agreement here. I don't feel in any way like a victim. I feel extremely privileged. I feel even beloved by the audience that is in my institution, in our institution. The only thing I did in my essay was sort of analyzing what kind of language we use about culture, how we try to domesticate the wild element in culture. I could even agree that there are some trends pointing in the right direction, but I mean, this is not so much intellectually interesting. I think it's a matter of where politics are going the next years, and I'm still not very optimistic, but I'm not complaining in any way. Could I just go back to one thing which Lasse in his opening statement, which Louise just said a lot about, namely the architectural quality of our institutions. I think this is a very interesting point also because it links to Casper's very productive remark about the tension between freedom and institution, which is not a problem, but which is a productive thing, and it's not a contradiction at all. The problem with the Sydney Opera House is that it is very beautiful from outside. So you can spend a lot of time without going in. So that's an interesting challenge. How do you get people in? Because I've been there myself, and people I've met from being in Australia, they say, "Did you see the Opera House?" "Yes, I saw it from outside." They say they never went. So that's that's an obvious challenge, and you can solve that. The way it was solved in the Louisiana Museum is that you can see it from the outside. It's brilliantly done. It's only an old villa, and you had to go in. So this is really good commercial thinking. Lasse has the same problem in Aalborg. You can see the museum behind him. It's really sufficient to see it from the outside, even though his museum is more beautiful from the inside. Yeah. So this points to the fact that we have some monuments to work with, and I think and this is really a very, very good challenge to the leaders of these institutions, because the whole concept of monumentality has to be vitalized by the things that we do. I mean, it's not enough just to sit, as Casper says. It's not enough just to sit there and wait. You have to invigorate the whole thing, and when you do this, you change the monumental quality of your house to be a kind of statement that people meet already when they come. They can see, here's a building where everything is decided on. This is the essence of architectural quality. Nothing is arbitrary. So you already met with a kind of philosophy that now you're entering a universe where people really think and have been thinking about form and content and activity and all these kind of central things that makes the aesthetic experience real. It was just a comment on the opening remark because Louise.
Can I comment on that, Lasse? Would you mind if I comment on that? Because I love that point. Yeah. And if you think about the journey, when you arrive at Louisiana and you come in and it's all very welcoming, and then you see that shop and you think, oh well, maybe I'll just go to the shop, and then you're sort of tempted and this, oh no, I'll keep that for the treat at the end because it's such a brilliant shop. And then you sort of walk down that corridor and you see one wonderful exhibition, and then you come around and then you see, I mean, basically your children's area was so impactful on me that when we came to do the renovations, about almost $500 million of renovations that we have done on the Opera House over the last 8 years, a central pillar of that is converting offices into a a space for children with a separate entrance built on a children's scale with a great outreach potential. So we look at each other's institutions, and the way that you do, food and beverage, the way that you can stay for dinner at Louisiana. So you're involving all of our senses, and there is marvelous art. But it's the whole way that you curate the total experience and attend to a whole lot of different things at the same time that I think builds into the richness of the experience. And so people don't feel the weight. You don't get museum legs going into Louisiana. You don't suddenly feel like you need to have a sleep like you do in some very old museums. So I think that making sure that we cater to everyone's interests, or to provide a broad range of interests, is also really important, and not to be too didactic about the way we go about it, because we are starting again.
Thank you.
It's really interesting discussions on this. Also, me being an architect, that you can say, in fact, we're discussing if great architecture can be both a blessing or a curse for inviting people inside. And Louise, could you say, because I know that some in the audience asked about this, how the things you've been doing online have affected kind of a new audience, but what have you, as Casper said, you have also been really successful prior to that, getting a kind of diverse audience. What has been the key elements in that?
Are you asking Louise?
I'm asking
no, you
Louise.
asking. Let's ask Paul Eric first while I think of an answer, and don't hold the conversation.
Yeah. No, I can say it very shortly. I mean, we have been doing, Louisiana is a small museum, and we felt like expanding 5, 6, 7 years ago. All my colleagues in the world, they are building all the time. They are expanding the museum. We cannot and we will not expand the museum. So we expanded into a digital audience. We created the Louisiana Channel, which produces 2 films a week, and have been doing that for 8 years now. And we have a worldwide audience. 9 million people were watching this channel last year. And this is a way of dealing with the content of what you're actually engaged in. It goes for music, architecture, design, visual arts, and it's the channel of the artists. Having said that, and looking at the COVID crisis, I think there's another optimistic thing. You know, the first lockdown, there was a huge kind of innovation. Everybody was very, quick to do things digital. And there was also a kind of innovative blessing in this. But in the second lockdown, people are so deadly bored and tired with the digital thing. I think this is my feeling, that now we're just waiting to get back to analog.
Yeah. If I does Casper want to say something?
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, you sure? Okay. It's a bit confusing having Louise in Louisiana. I've actually quite liked that, it's very similar. Whenever Lasse says it, because he says Louise and Louisiana, I always think, oh, how's he going to end that word? But anyway, if you're talking about me, so one of the things that when the Opera House was set up, so in a normal year, we would have 2 million, about 2 million people would come and see a show or pay to go on a tour. So that's a lot of people coming inside. And we would, and we'd have a couple of million food and beverage transactions, about 2.5 million food and beverage transactions in a year. So we have a lot of people doing things. But it was set up in the 1970s. We're about to have our 50th anniversaries in a couple of years, and Lasse was part of our 40th anniversary. So it's funny to think that it's almost another 10 years. But we were set up in the 70s, particularly for what are resident companies, state-funded organisations, the opera, the ballet, the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, the Sydney Theatre Company, and so on. And that's important. But it's also important that we always splice new voices and new art forms and new ways of seeing things. So we have something called Sydney Opera House Presents. And Sydney Opera House Presents puts on about almost 45% of the performances that are on the at the Opera House. That's contemporary music. It's contemporary performance. So, you know, circus and you know, 1 or 2 man shows. It's First Nations. It's children and families and education. So we'll have about 200,000 children and families joining us physically every year for our programming. So to be very sort of strategic about the way we dissect these new audiences that we're going for and presenting new art forms. And I'm really keen on just sticking to those areas and saying this is where we're going to focus, as well as continuing to support our resident companies.
Great, Louise. We'll move. I have quite some questions from the audience, and perhaps we should let them in. That there are some, Kasper, it links back to, there's a question from Janice Sandberg. She's the director of Enigma Museum, and she asked, she responds that she likes your positive attitude, but she also says, how can we go beyond that in the discussion with politicians, that it often ends up saying, please send more money. And then some are asking, this opening of during COVID that Louise mentioned, that we have a digital audience suddenly, and Paul Erik also mentioned it, asking, are there business models in this? So,
yeah.
So 2 questions. How do we don't ask politicians for money and instead discussing relevance and quality with them? And then what are the business model after COVID?
So first of all, I think it's really encouraging that we've been able to build digital audiences. Like Louise, we've been really happy to see that we had also hundreds of thousands of hours watched. For my thing, for theaters, I think it is not a viable business model. I think ultimately it's not the same experience. And to be honest, for me, the question of reaching more people is more important and worth more than having people pay, you know, $3 for a ticket to see something online. So we've joked, because you know that the moment you set up a paywall and people have to have a login, you will address the people who already love the theater. Whereas we know now that because our offer has been free, you can just push a button and you go. We've been able to write to care centers, we've written to schools, we've written to elderly homes around Denmark, saying, look, you're home alone, you have nothing to do, try and watch half an hour of Napoli, the ballet, that will give you some joy in life. And we've had an amazing response from schools, from care centers, from old people, from other people around Denmark who write back and say, I never thought I would try the ballet, and actually this was quite enjoyable. They don't watch the whole show. It's not a comparable experience to going to the theater, but they get a taste, they get curious, they feel the Royal Theatre had an offering for that. That is for me worth so much more than the $2 I could take a ticket. So I think what we've learned is that digital will play a role in the future, but as a way of interplay with the physical experience, as a way of reaching more people, opening more people's curiosity. And that is the key task for us ahead, making sure that not only the privileged children, the people who already know the theater, know that these institutions are for them, but bringing this to more people who can be curious and see if it's for them. The other point, well, surely I think that the way to go beyond the financial discussion with politicians is if we talk also about what we want to do with some sense of energy, passion, if we take control of our own future and think about how we want to develop. You know, I've tried at the theater when I arrived to develop a big growth strategy in order to be able to go and talk with confidence. But having said that, I do think it is important that when we talk to politicians, we should talk about money. Because I've worked in the UK where subsidy is much less. And what happens if subsidy shrinks? It gets less relevant to more people. It gets less accessible. It becomes more for the privileged, and the arts become less risk-taking. So we, you know, in the end, I think it is the role of politicians that we talk to them about resources and framework. And I think that's okay. But if we do it in a moaning way, in the way of a victim, then the discussion will stop there. Who wants to invest in something that's going really terribly? If we do it with passion and with a belief in our own future, if I believe there's a future for theatre, then an appetite with more people for theatre, then I do believe I can get politicians to invest in it too. and then it's okay that we talk money with them.
Can I disagree a little bit?
Yeah, yeah.
Lesser?
Yeah.
I think it was
Yeah.
a good idea to disagree just a little bit. So what Casper is saying, I agree in part, but I am going to disagree in a second. You don't have to choose, right? So you can, in terms of your audience. So yes, we opened it all up when it was free. But if you're in the situation like us and Louisiana, where you actually need revenue in order to be sure that you can continue to produce a good product, because having the cash is always going to help you enrich the product. So I think you can say, that for schools and aged care and for people who are by themselves, it is free. But for those who can pay, I think it's good to have an opportunity to pay, and you don't have to choose one or the other. And we haven't chosen one or the other. We choose a mix between those two things, some things to pay for, some things not to pay for, and you can seek an exemption if you would need to pay. But we have been amazed that, as I said before about our All About Women Festival, which is being held this weekend, we've sold the same number of on-site tickets that we would expect, plus we have sold an additional 30% of tickets online. Now, the price is like $25 a ticket, but that's still meaningful. And it's particularly meaningful when you take into account that a lot of the speakers that we have are online speakers. So instead of having to pay them $40,000 to come and spend a week getting to and from Australia and having a hotel and all their meals, we pay them for 2 hours of preparation and 1 hour of being on the Zoom call. So it's a whole lot cheaper. So the business model can be different. And then the second thing is that I actually agree with what Casper's saying on the second point. But the second point is, the problem is that we lack a language. The reason that people default into this moaning victimhood is because you can measure money, but how do you measure people's love of the arts? And this is why I love Paul Eric's thing about the X-ray. If you reopen and people come, if you offer tickets and 100,000 people turn up to 8 weeks of performances, basically all are sold out. That is saying we crave this. So I really encourage everyone to take their stats as they, as Casper was talking about after the first lockdown. When people can come, they really want to come. And we can't afford to do this without subsidy. And yet it is something that the public absolutely craves. So let's support it, because we can do better. We can have a better society. We can have a richer, more diverse and more, multifunctional sort of society if we encourage this.
Paul Erik, short.
Yeah, short. I mean, I totally agree with. I like what you're saying, Louise. I agree with Casper that, of course, we should talk about money. Also a way of guaranteeing the arm's length principle. We ask for money and then we deliver. Deliver what? Yeah. Talking about business model for the digital thing, there is no straightforward business model that is working. I've spoken to 60 directors all around the world the last year. There is nothing that really works, but it works in some way, in a more sophisticated way. When we do the channel, we are building audiences, and it's a kind of cosmological business model. I'm sorry about the word, but it is. So it means actually that we are building audiences where people are getting more interested in art. And the return of investment is very little. I mean, it is when they come to the Louisiana Museum, but they might go to the Brazilian National Art Gallery because they're sitting there seeing videos about art. So we are actually building a worldwide audience of people interested in what we are doing. And that is a kind of business model. It just needs to be a kind of have this kind of political legitimation or being recognized by the politicians that this is very useful. This is what we do. I mean, the idealism of cultural institutions is actually an investment.
That was, I think that was actually a great ending remark, can we call it that? And I feel really, even though I've had three guests being quite agreeing on things, then it was really, really interesting to get insights, both from Sydney and from Copenhagen and Humlebæk, Louisiana, and that we're actually looking the great cultural major institutions are like platforms for artistic expression, and they are basis for creating diversity, innovation, and but that we together should kind of develop a language that are a bit more refined, meeting politicians. And Louise, I know her, so when Casper and Paul Erik says there's not a business model, she's like, oh my God, there is. You'll always find but also that the business model works both ways for all of you, that it's not all about money, it's about content and how we actually create this innovation, whether it's in bigger, in cultural societies or with artists, or it's in the minds of young people that go into the kids' house of Louisiana, or the Casper, we haven't discussed that, but you are launching a universe for families and kids in the old opera stage, which is fantastic. We can take a whole debate on that. So thank you very much to all of you. It's really been, I think we are all a bit more enlightened, and also our moods have gone up, especially here in Denmark. Thanks. And
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.